Chronicles of Christ, the Resurrection Appearances. Here is the first strange thing, and it's so strange I don't know why it isn't the most famous fact in the whole story. Nearly every time the risen Jesus shows up, the people who loved him most have no idea who he is. Mary Magdalene, who had stood at the cross when the men ran, who came to the tomb in the dark to tend his body, meets him in the garden and thinks he's the gardener. Two of his own followers walk 7 miles down the road to Emmaus beside him, talking the whole way about him, and don't recognize him until he breaks the bread. A boat full of his closest disciples, men who'd spent 3 years at his side, squint at a figure on the shore at dawn and haven't the faintest idea it's him until the nets come up full. And in Matthew, at the single most solemn moment of all, the risen Christ on a mountain, commissioning the 11 to carry his name to the ends of the earth, Matthew drops in 5 words that no forger on earth would ever write, but some doubted. Sit with that. The foundation stone of the entire Christian faith is a series of encounters in which the witnesses, again and again, don't know him or aren't sure or flatly doubt, and the gospel writers left every bit of it in. I want to start here because it tells you what kind of evidence we're dealing with in this last chronicle, and it's not the kind you were sold in Sunday school. The tidy version goes, Jesus rose, appeared in a blaze of obvious glory, everyone fell down convinced, roll credits. The actual texts are stranger, rougher, and I'll argue far more interesting and in their own peculiar way, far more trustworthy for being so rough, because a man inventing a religion smooths the evidence. He does not hand you doubting apostles and mistaken identity scenes, and 4 accounts that can't agree on what city everyone was standing in. So let's do what this room always does. Let's look at all of it, the encounters, the contradictions, the oldest witness and the buried ones, the body that ate fish and walked through walls, and let's follow it all the way to the end. Because this is the end. This is where the story of Jesus runs out of road, and how a story chooses to end tells you what it thought it was about. 4 endings that don't match. Let me lay the accounts side by side, honestly the way I did with the empty tomb, because if the discoveries at the tomb didn't line up, the appearances line up even less. Start with the biggest crack, the one careful readers have wrestled with for centuries. Where did the appearances happen? Mark's young man at the tomb says, "Go to Galilee, there you will see him." Matthew agrees emphatically. The angel says Galilee, the risen Jesus himself says Galilee, and sure enough the climactic appearance is on a mountain in Galilee, 60-odd miles north of the city. But open Luke and Jesus says the exact opposite, stay in the city, stay in Jerusalem, and every appearance Luke narrates happens in or right beside Jerusalem that same day. 2 Gospels march the disciples north to Galilee, one keeps them locked in Jerusalem and tells them not to leave. That is not a difference of detail, that's a different map. And John characteristically has it both ways, Jerusalem in chapter 20, then a whole extra chapter up in Galilee by the lake. Which is a good moment to mention that most scholars think John chapter 21 is an appendix, tacked on after the gospel had already ended, because chapter 20 wraps up with a formal, unmistakable ending. These are written so that you may believe. And then chapter 21 just starts again, like a bonus track after the album's closing song. Even the book's own structure has a seam in it. Now you can stitch these together if you're determined. People do. They construct an itinerary. The disciples saw him in Jerusalem on Sunday, then traveled up to Galilee for the mountain scene, then came back to Jerusalem for the ascension 40 days on. And maybe that's what happened. But I want you to notice something, because it's the whole discipline of this room in one observation. That itinerary is written in no gospel, not one. It's a schedule assembled by readers centuries later to make 4 accounts hold hands. The texts themselves don't offer it. Matthew doesn't know about the Jerusalem appearances, Luke doesn't know about or actively contradicts the trip to Galilee. Each writer tells his own ending as if it were the only one. And Mark, the earliest of them all, as we saw when we stood at the empty tomb, in its oldest form has no appearance at all. It ends with terrified women and a promise not yet kept. The first gospel written doesn't show you the risen Christ even once. Here's what I make of all this, and it's the same thing I made of it at the tomb. 4 witnesses who agree on the earthquake at the center, he was seen, he was alive, everything changed, and disagree on nearly every detail around it, are not 4 liars caught in a botched conspiracy. Liars coordinate. 4 people genuinely wrestling to describe the most disorienting event of their lives, decades apart in different communities, will hand you exactly this: a shared, unshakable core and a tangle of mismatched edges. I'm not going to iron the tangle flat. The tangle is the texture of something real. The body that ate fish and walked through walls. Now to the genuinely weird part, and I mean weird, the thing the gospel writers themselves clearly couldn't fully get their arms around, because they keep telling you 2 opposite things about it in the same breath. On one hand, the risen body is aggressively, insistently physical. Luke goes out of his way on this. When Jesus appears to the disciples and they panic, thinking they're seeing a ghost, he doesn't reassure them with soothing words, he tells them to touch him. A spirit does not have flesh and bones, as you see that I have. And then, in what may be the single most down-to-earth detail in the entire resurrection story, he asks if they've got anything to eat, and they hand him a piece of broiled fish, and he eats it in front of them. A ghost does not ask for supper. John gives you the same physicality. The wounds are still there, the nail marks, the hole in his side, solid enough that Thomas is invited to put his finger in them. On the other hand, the very same body appears inside a room with the doors locked. Twice John tells us that the doors were shut and suddenly he was standing among them. The same body vanishes at Emmaus the instant they recognize him. The Greek says he simply became invisible, gone. The same body goes unrecognized by people who knew him well. This is not an ordinary resurrected corpse walking back out into ordinary life, like Lazarus blinking in the tomb doorway. This is something the writers don't have a category for, solid enough to eat fish, strange enough to pass through a wall, and they just report both and let you sit in the tension. I find that honesty almost unbearable and completely convincing. They're not smoothing it into a doctrine. They're telling you what they say they saw, even though it doesn't fit. While we're in John, let me clear away 2 bits of well-loved pulpit lore, because a teacher who lets a nice story stand in for the truth isn't earning his keep. First, you have heard, I guarantee it, a sermon about doubting Thomas that lingers on the moment Thomas jams his finger into the wounds. Go read John chapter 20 again, it never says he did. Jesus invites him to, put your finger here, and Thomas's response is immediate and total, my Lord and my God. The touching is offered, whether Thomas took him up on it, the text simply doesn't say. The most famous doubter in history may never have needed the proof he demanded. Second, from the Lakeside chapter, you may have heard a lovely sermon about how when Jesus asks Peter 3 times, do you love me? He uses 2 different Greek words for love, a higher, divine love, and a lower, friendly one, and how the whole passage is a delicate ladder between them. It's a beautiful sermon. The Greek scholars are, I'm sorry to say, largely unconvinced. John swaps words like that constantly. He uses 2 different words for know, 2 for sheep, 2 for feed, all over the passage, apparently just for style. Reading a deep theology into this particular word swap, when the author shuffles his vocabulary on every other line, is probably asking the text to carry a sermon it never signed up for. The threefold question is moving enough on its own: 3 denials by a charcoal fire on the night of the trial, 3 affirmations by a charcoal fire on the shore. It doesn't need the Greek lesson upgrade. The oldest witness leaves out the women. Now I have to turn the lamp on the awkward evidence again, the way I did at the tomb, because the honest teacher shows you the ledger's other column. The oldest account of the appearances isn't in any gospel. It's older than all of them, a few lines Paul quotes in 1 Corinthians, a creed he says he received and passed on, a formula already polished smooth by repetition before Paul ever got to it, dating to within just a few years of the crucifixion. It's the closest thing we have to a bulletin from the scene. And it gives a list. Christ appeared to Peter, then to the 12, then to more than 500 at once, then to James, then to all the apostles, and, last of all, to Paul himself. Read that list carefully and things jump out, or rather things go missing. There are no women in it. None. Mary Magdalene, who in all 4 Gospels is the first to meet the risen Christ, who anchored the entire chronicle of the empty tomb, she's simply not there. The 500 appear in this list and nowhere else in the New Testament. No Gospel breathes a word about 500 people seeing Jesus at once. The appearance to James, Jesus' own brother, is listed here and narrated in no Gospel at all. And the appearance to Peter, which Paul puts first, the leadoff, the anchor witness, is mentioned in passing by Luke, but never actually shown anywhere in the Bible. The most important single appearance in the earliest list is one the Gospels never bothered to dramatize. I'm not telling you this to unsettle you. I'm telling you because it's true, and because the shape of the disagreement is itself a kind of evidence. These are clearly independent streams of memory, not a coordinated script, or they'd match. But I won't pretend the seams aren't there. And then there's the deepest wrinkle of all, and it sits right at the end of Paul's list in that little phrase, last of all to me. Because how did Jesus appear to Paul? Not by a lakeside, not eating fish. Paul met the risen Christ as a blinding light and a voice on the road to Damascus, years after everyone else, and by his own account touched nothing and shared no meal. It was, by any plain description, a vision. And here's the thing that should stop you. Paul uses the exact same word for what happened to him as for what happened to Peter and the 12 and the 500. He appeared to Cephas, he appeared to me. One word off, he was seen, laid identically over the fish-eating Jesus of the locked room and the blaze of light on the Damascus road. Paul draws no distinction in kind. To the earliest witness we have, whatever happened to him on that road and whatever happened to Peter in that room were, somehow, the same category of thing. You can read that two ways, and honesty demands I give you both. The skeptic says, there it is, the appearances, even the ones the Gospels later dressed up as physical, may all have begun as what Paul's plainly was, visionary experiences, later elaborated into fish and footprints. The believer says, not so fast, that verb is just the ordinary Greek for was seen. It's used of God appearing to Abraham, it can't bear that much weight, and Paul elsewhere argues hard for a transformed but real body, not a phantom. I lean toward the second, but I will not hand you the first as though it were a cheap trick, because it isn't. It's the single most honest question in the whole subject, and it's sitting right there in our oldest source in one Greek word. The man who kept teaching for 11 years. Let me show you a road the church chose not to take, because you can only really understand a decision by seeing what it rejected, and this one is a genuine delight in a slightly unhinged way. The Gospels give the risen Jesus a short window. He appears, he eats, he commissions, and Luke tells us after 40 days he's gone, brief, bodily, enclosed. But that was not the only option on the table in the early centuries, not by a long way. There was a whole rival library of texts, most of them Gnostic, most from the 2nd and 3rd centuries, that seized on the resurrection appearances as the perfect literary opportunity. Think about it, a risen, glorified Christ back among his disciples before he ascends, what a frame for revealing secret teaching. And so they ran with it, and they ran, and they ran. Watch the clock stretch. The canonical Acts gives the risen Christ 40 days of teaching. Fair enough. Then you open a Gnostic text called the Secret Book of James, and the disciples address the risen Lord 550 days after he arose from the dead. And then my favorite, the reductio ad absurdum of the entire impulse, you open the Pistis Sophia, and it declares with a straight face that after rising from the dead Jesus passed 11 years discoursing with his disciples. 11 years, the poor disciples, you imagine, checking their sundials. And the beautiful part, the part that tells you everything. Even that text can't keep its own story straight. A later section of the very same manuscript puts the teaching back on the 3rd day. The still teaching impulse had floated so far free of any anchor in memory that it couldn't even agree with itself. Now I am not telling you Jesus taught for 11 years. Let me be as clear as I know how. This is 3rd century religious imagination. Centuries after the fact, using the resurrection as a stage set for cosmic speculation, I file it under legend, told as legend. But I want you to see the fault line it reveals, because it's the deep question this whole final chronicle circles. Is the revelation closed, or is it open? Did God say what he had to say in a brief, bodily, bounded season and then stop? Or is the risen Christ an endless fountain of new secret knowledge, still whispering to whoever claims the right ears? The church decisively chose closed, and you can watch it make that choice in real time. There's an early text, the Epistula Apostolorum from around 140, written by Orthodox Christians who were furious at the Gnostics, and it's a wonderful piece of strategy. It borrows the Gnostics' own beloved format, the risen Christ teaching dialogue, and turns it against them. In it, the risen Jesus insists his teaching is not secret. It's for everyone, all the apostles, not a chosen elite. And it hammers the physical, touch the nail prints, put your hand in the wound, and my favorite line, a phantom of a devil makes no footprint on the earth. Footprints. The risen Christ leaves footprints. That's the Orthodox flag planted in the ground. He was real, he was brief, and the age of new appearances is over. And here's a thought to take home about why your Bible looks the way it does. The 4 Gospels you have are a selection out of a much wider, wilder field. Some of the appearance stories that didn't make the cut look perfectly orthodox. The Gospel of Peter tells a lakeside appearance in a completely conventional way, and it survives only because the manuscript breaks off mid-sentence, right as the scene begins. I, Simon Peter, and my brother Andrew took our nets and went to the sea, and with us was Levi, and then the papyrus simply ends, and we never get the appearance. Meanwhile, the 11 years of secret teaching texts survive perfectly intact because someone buried them in a jar in the Egyptian desert, where no one could read them to death. The tradition you inherited isn't the only story that was ever told. It's the one the church kept reading out loud in the daylight because it decided this was the true shape, brief, bodily, and closed. Why it stops. Which brings us to the ending of the ending, the ascension, the moment the appearances stop. And even here, at the very last door, the texts won't give me a clean line, so I won't give you one. Luke tells the story twice, and the 2 versions don't match. In his gospel, read it straight through, and the whole thing, the empty tomb, the road to Emmaus, the appearance to the disciples, and the ascension at Bethany, seems to happen on one single day, Easter Sunday, no gap marked anywhere. But in Acts, by the same author, he says Jesus appeared to them over the course of 40 days before being taken up. Same writer, 2 clocks. And it gets sharper still. This is a small gem of the manuscript trade. The words in Luke's gospel that actually say, and was carried up into heaven, are missing from some of the oldest copies we have, including Codex Sinaiticus. Which means Luke's gospel may originally have had no ascension in it at all, and the line got added later to make it match Acts. Even the exit is contested. Even the last sentence has a seam. But step back from the mechanics, because the meaning of the ascension is the thing this whole chronicle, this whole series has been walking toward. What the ascension is, theologically, is the deliberate, chosen end of the appearances. It's Christ drawing a line under the season of showing up. And notice, Paul felt this too. Remember how he ended his list. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. Paul knew he was the caboose. The appearances were a bounded set, a closing series, and he was the final entry, the door swinging shut behind him. Nobody after Paul gets to say, and then he appeared to me too, and be believed. That season was declared over. Why would a risen God, having conquered death, pull back the one thing that made belief easy, the visible, touchable, fish-eating proof? The Gospels give an answer, and it's the answer that turns this from a story about them into a story about you. He withdraws so that something else can begin. It is to your advantage that I go away, he says earlier in John, for if I do not go away, the Helper will not come. The visible Christ ascends precisely so the invisible Spirit can descend, so the age of witnesses seeing can hand off to the age of the church going. The proof is deliberately taken off the table so that faith and its harder, braver cousin, trust, can take its place. It's the same logic Jesus hands Thomas in the locked room. Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. That beatitude is aimed straight over Thomas's shoulder, out of the page, at every reader who was never in the room. At you, at me. The open door. So here we are at the last page of the last chronicle, and I want to tell you honestly what I think the evidence can and cannot do, because I've tried to earn the right to say it across 12 of these now. Here's what history can do. It can establish, about as firmly as it establishes anything from the ancient world, that a specific group of people who had known Jesus, plus at least one man who had violently hated his movement, came to be utterly, life-appendingly convinced that they had met him alive after watching him die. It can show you that this conviction arose absurdly early, within a few years, not layered on by centuries of legend. It can show you these people paid for that conviction, some with their lives, and that inventing it would have profited them nothing they'd have wanted. The sincerity of the witnesses is, to my eye, one of the best attested facts in all of antiquity. And here's what history cannot do. It cannot walk the last step. It cannot tell you, using its own tools, manuscripts and dates and cross-check testimony, whether those witnesses were right, whether the tomb was empty because God raised him or empty for some reason lost to us, whether the light on the Damascus road was heaven breaking in or a mind breaking down. That question isn't smaller than history, it's larger than history, and it stands on the far side of a threshold that document criticism was never built to cross. And it's an honest threshold, cutting both ways. History can't prove the resurrection, and it can't disprove it either, because we know of nothing else like it, has never once been the same sentence as therefore it did not happen. So the evidence brings you to a door and sets down its tools, and I've come to think that's not a failure of the story. I've come to think it's the point of the story, the point the ascension was making all along. The risen Christ took the easy proof off the table on purpose. He walked out of the frame. And the very last thing Matthew's gospel does, the last thing before it simply stops, is turn and hand the whole unfinished business to the reader. Go therefore. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. No tidy conclusion, no curtain, a command and a promise that reaches out of the first century and lands, still warm in your own. That's how the story of Jesus ends. Not with a proof that closes the case, but with an open door and a hand held out, the same hand you'll notice that reached down into the dark and pulled the first man up by the wrist, that broke the bread at Emmaus that a doubter was invited to touch. The story doesn't end. It runs out of road and turns to look at you, and asks the only question it was ever really asking. We've walked a long way together, from a manger with an ox and a donkey borrowed from an old prophet, through a river and a mountain in a borrowed upper room, down into the silence of a Saturday and up into the light of a Sunday nobody actually watched happen. 12 Chronicles, every witness heard. And it ends as the best stories do, not with an answer handed to you, but with a door left open and the oldest invitation in the world standing in it. Go on then, see for yourself.